Please give a warm welcome to editor John Paul and director Blitz Bazawule. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Blitz, I mentioned to you briefly outside when I met you that I have never seen in film the connection between trauma and imagination. Normally, when characters are portrayed in cinema that have gone through trauma and abuse, they're portrayed as weak characters. Instead, you show a character that's able to champion through things through imagination. Can you tell us about that approach that is extremely unique?
Absolutely, and thank you all for being here. It's such a pleasure. Yeah, you know, for me, it was about going back to Alice Walker's brilliant Pulitzer Prize-winning book. When I got the opportunity to make this film, I was quite intimidated. As you guys know, the bar is quite high. It is a Steven Spielberg classic. It is a Tony Award-winning Broadway play. So I was quite uncertain how to even approach it. So I went back to Alice's book, and I found what I was looking for, first page, first line. Dear God, I'm 14 years old. And I said, stop. Anyone who can write letters to God must have an imagination, a sprawling imagination. And my job was to expand that imagination, give Celie everything she could imagine that involved how to love, who to love, how to forgive, how to chart her way out of abuse, because you are right, the misconception is that those who suffer abuse and trauma are docile, passive, waiting to be saved. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. People who deal with abuse and trauma are constantly working in their minds how to liberate themselves, how to break themselves out of this bondage of trauma and abuse. And I think that Celie was a perfect example of what happens when you get into the character's headspace. You find that they're active and they're building, and eventually they will arrive at where they're trying to get to. Yeah.
Yeah, and when I introduced the film, I said that I'm not a big musical theater fan because once they break into song, I go, oh God, check me out. But instead, you use the music to give us an inner world to Celie that we have never seen before. Can you tell us about?
Yeah, I mean, we knew that very early, that musicals, people have a love-hate relationship with musicals, to put it very, very nicely. There are a few that we really love, and there are plenty we really hate. And we talked a lot, the whole team, about why musicals had such a challenging relationship with the audience. And I think one of the first things that we all agreed with, myself, my DP, my music team, was that often music just appears out of the sky. And that's the problem. So we were very adamant that there will always be a source for the music, whether it was diegetic sounds, environmental sounds that will build in cadence and finally arrive at this bigger musical world. And we decided right from opening shot, we were going to go straight for what we intended to be the version of a musical we were making, starting with the horse's hoofs that build into the little banjo that comes in, the girls in the tree playing patty cake, and then before you know it, we're in this lush world. And we just kept that going, the gentleman building the house, the hammers, the saws, we used that to build. And then whenever we weren't going to use diegetic sounds, we will use environmental sounds like the record player, right, which is a real sound, which then kind of transitions us into this giant gramophone that kind of becomes its own world, or the movie theater, where the music that's seeping out of that movie kind of sucks us into this world. And so we were very aware and very adamant that we were going to make the kind of musical that people actually liked. Thank you.
Yeah. John, bring you in. The opening sequence, he talked a little bit about it, that we hear the horse's hooves, and then we hear the patty cakes, and slowly we are sucked into this musical world. Can you tell us about editing that opening sequence?
Well, the opening shot is one shot that holds everything. And it's a really interesting shot because we're above.
Yeah, it's a bird's eye.
We're above. We're not revealing Mister at that moment. We're just hearing a guy playing the banjo, and we're hearing the horse hooves. And actually, Blitz did a really interesting thing with frame rates in that shot, in that the horse is at slow-mo, and the whole thing is shot at slow-mo. And then by the time we get to the girls, it's at real speed. And it's nothing that would make you go, oh, what's going on here? But it's just a very subtle piece that tells you something's different. And I think that's part of why that works so well. Because by the time you get to, it's probably like a minute in that one shot before we get to the beach and hear a little bit of dialogue. But I think it lets you into the world. And once you have that, maybe a giant gramophone isn't crazy.
And Blitz, you alluded to the previous Spielberg film and the previous musical versions, but I'll be blunt. The Spielberg film, as venerated as it is, it was a white man's version of this story. And tell us about the importance of having Black artists bring in their own understanding of the material.
Yeah. Well, Stephen is my producer. So, yeah. But no, he was kind. When we first spoke, I asked him, this was one of my first questions was, what would you do differently? And he was very, very blunt. He was like, Blitz, I will never touch this. I'll find somebody who is closer to the material and I'll support them. And that's exactly what he did. He let me make my movie. And but to your question, I think there is importance in proximity to the material, right? I can go to Germany as an outsider and make a movie in Germany without knowing the language, knowing the people. I can shoot a movie. No one's going to stop me. But there are nuances in Germany that I will never understand. There's subtleties. There are layers. And so, it's quite important that when it comes to material, especially material like this that is very culturally specific, all right, it is quite important that the creators, or at least the leaders of that, are proximate to it, to the material. And I think that there are elements of how Black culture functions where the oscillation between joy and pain, being able to turn pain into power, right? That is very specific to a people who have been through levels of trauma, right? Snatched from a continent and dispersed around the world quite violently. It's a very specific way of survival in this world. And I think it's impossible for a people who only dwell in pain and trauma to bequeath the world with such beautiful manifestations of art, jazz, funk, gospel. I mean, all these things that require joy at the
Yeah.
center. And so, yes, you know, Stephen could see Alice's work from a very specific vantage point. I see it from a more of a multi-angle cam.
Correct. Yeah.
You know, where I can understand how that pain can be processed into joy. And that's all this film became, was just, you know, back and forth, where you called it trauma recovery. Well, your wife called it trauma recovery. Let me give her credit. Trauma recovery. And I think that that's what this film is about. It's constantly dipping in and out. And eventually, when we're around that tree, you know, that is ultimate recovery.
Gorgeous sequence.
Thank you.
I mean, I get emotional watching it again. I'm glad you brought up the pain and joy, because when I was watching the film, that's not a single frame in this film that pain and joy are shared on the screen. Can you tell us, both of you, John, about that balance? In almost every sequence, there is light and darkness. There's pain and joy.
Well, literally from the first time I spoke to Blitz on the longest job interview I've ever had in my life, it was amazing. Blitz played me songs. Blitz asked me questions. We kind of just hung out and talked. But Blitz pitched me his idea. I think I was quite frank that, you know, trauma is not easy for me. And normally a movie like this, I would be wary of doing personally. And what really moved me about the film was that it wasn't just about trauma, and it was really about overcoming it. And if Celie can overcome it, we can all overcome it. And I think that's how I feel. This movie kind of changed me. I have a different relationship with myself. I have a different relationship with trauma, and I think it's exactly as Blitz is saying. Every character in the movie even has these different feelings. I mean, characters you wouldn't expect end up with a little bit of redemption and find some peace. Even Celie, who is the center of the movie, makes a big mistake in it, a human mistake. And I don't know if I'm answering your question properly, but I think it's there in the DNA of the book. You know, when I first came on, I listened to one song from the musical, and Blitz knew from our initial meeting I had the same feelings about musicals with him. And my prep was basically listening to Alice Walker read her novel on Audible, the 250-page book that she took 7 hours to read. I listened to it 3 times, and I felt between Blitz's point of view on the movie and what he wanted to do, and being able to hear her, I learned so much. That was just sort of the path, and I think, you know, I don't know, but for me, this feels closer to the book.
Blitz, you developed the male characters further that we've seen before. Can you tell us the importance of developing the male character?
Well, it was very important because I think, you know, ultimately, those characters operate on a gradient, right? There is old Mister who is stuck in his ways and will never change. There's Mister who has possibility of redemption if he will kind of break away from his father. And there's Harpo, who very early knows that something is wrong with that continuum. And I think for me, one of the most powerful shots in the movie, it's very subtle and understated, but it's when at the Easter table, everybody just kind of leaves the table, and it's a mess, and we just kind of linger, just watching old Mister at one corner and Mister. And I remember standing next to Dan Lawston and going, just keep the camera alive, because this shot encapsulates everything that is this movie. These two men who pass generational trauma from one to the other are the reason for so much pain and anguish that has happened. And if we just sat and watched that frame, we will understand everything this film is about. And the fact that Harpo was outside already trying to make right? And these two men just sitting, facing each other with all their brokenness and not knowing how to even communicate, really. So that silent moment for me was very important. But yeah, it was very, very, I have a 14-year-old son, and, you know, I find that it is a very similar thing. My relationship with my father was, he's very old school, he's a very old African dad, you know. There wasn't a lot of affection and communication, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that comes from that kind of background. And the goal was, as I raised my son, unlearning those things, which I know were traumas that my dad carried from his dad, which was an even more distant, more divided, more challenging past, right? And so I needed a character that my son will see as aspirational, that I will see as aspirational, and Harpo was that character. And I did a lot to try to give him that nuance, you know, and vulnerability, and exorcising that toxic masculinity that his father's carrying and his father's carrying. And I think that just having that gradient alone, I think, is service to Alice Walker's work, you know. And I think that a lot of younger people are going to look at this and go, all right, there's a path for me. And even Mister's redemption itself, right, which required accountability, you know, which I think was very important for him to reckon with himself. Another very powerful kind of question and answer shot are when Mister's at his most powerful when he kicks Nettie out in the rain. And he's at his weakest and most vulnerable when he's in a fetal position in the rain. And it's another moment I was like, Dan, just keep the camera alive. Keep it alive. Let's just watch this man wallow in all of his weakness, right? And have him have a moment, which then allows him to go, wait, I need to wake up, you know? And it's that thing where it's a moment of clarity for him, right? And so it was important for me that as much as this movie is about these women and their sisterhood and how they help each other, which for me was also my mother, watching her and her friends be their sister circle that helped them help heal these men that were so broken, but didn't even know they were broken, right? And so being a kid and watching how my aunties and my mother and my neighbors would all kind of sit together, talk about their past, talk about how they're going to move forward. Really, a lot of it lives in this movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and kudos to you for
Thank you.
incredible. Coleman Domingo is amazing.
Wow.
And Louis Gossett Jr., yeah, the casting is out of this world, and you did well. It's amazing. John, I want to ask you about the natural sound when people start singing, and how that was achieved.
Well, we had a great team of people led by Blitz who recorded all the music in the beginning, recorded versions of all the songs. There are some songs that have live vocals in them, and we had a great sound team. And we were very aware of sound. Before our sound team even came on, we were doing things with, and Paul Massey, who actually lives quite near here, was our lead mixer, and he was just kind of a magician with it. A lot of things on this movie are done very simply. The lighting is simple. Everything is, I think everyone used a soft touch and a gentle hand, and we were trying to make the movie just feel like you're watching it and you're in it and not taken out by it, and that would it's all about whatever emotion we create and the story and characters. And I think everything led to that approach. We were trying not to push people to emotion. We knew that the emotion would come to them if they felt
But
it.
you also interweave the music without overwhelming the story.
Yes, there's honestly a lot of music in the movie. There are 15 songs, there are 15 needle drops, and Chris Bowers, our composer, had an amazing job, difficult job to do, because he has to help us get in and out of some of these things in transition. And that's equally like everyone jumping up and going, okay, we're going to sing. That's another place where you can make a misstep. And Chris very delicately took themes from the songs and put them into the score.
And you use them to carry through.
Yes, and we use a lot of the natural sounds, and we also are doing in numerous places where we're pulling sound out at kind of an important moment to underline, but without a yellow highlighter, what's going on dramatically. So sound is a huge part of the movie, and honestly, from that first horse clop, we're aware of it.
Blitz, I love your usage of color. I noticed that in the first half of the film, you withhold the color purple, and it's all like browns and greens. Reds are withheld for people of power. Like when Taraji arrives, she's all reds. Tell us about the color coding that you use throughout the film.
Wow. Well, he knows everything about my movie. I mean, there's nothing to say here. Yeah, well, thank you. I started as a visual artist. As a kid in Ghana, there wasn't access to cameras, even though I've always wanted to make film. Wasn't access to recording equipment, even though I've always wanted to make music. But what I always had was pencils, pens, colors. So I always painted and drew, and so that's really where it all begun for me, was visual arts. And over time, I, got lucky and started, having these opportunities from, of course, my very first feature film, The Burial of Kojo, which I went to Ghana to shoot, and working with Beyonce on Black is King, and then, having this opportunity. But I still always go back to being that kid in Ghana drawing. There's nothing I do without sketching and drawing and painting first. And for this film, for instance, I drew close to 1,500 frames of storyboard. And it took a while, but I didn't stop there. I also went ahead, scanned all those storyboards, and I cut them into a 2-hour 15 sequence, which became the chagrin of my team, because every time, everybody that was hired, it was mandatory, because I'm a bit OCD, to sit and watch this 2-hour, 15-minute movie. Pretty much. But my goal was to make sure we were all making the same movie. If I gave a script to each one of us, same words, same everything, we'll all show up with 3 different movies, because it's how you see the world. And the only way to get a massive team of people to make the movie you want is to show them the frames you're going to shoot, so that everybody can work towards that frame. You can explain how color will work, so everybody can work towards that color. And I found that when I showed, to each of my HODs, there were laughter, there was crying, there was all the things that happen in an auditorium now. And my thing was, if my 2-hour, 15 minute, mishmash of pencil sketches and pens and inking and all that stuff could evoke that emotion, then what can I do if I bring in a Dan Lawston, who's a master of light, a Fatima Robinson, who's a master choreographer, a Paul Asterberry, who's a master production designer, a Francine Jameson Tunchuk, who, by the way, worked on Steven Spielberg's 1985 movie as an assistant costumer and now became my lead costumer on this movie. So those conversations were all heart. And it was about how we all gonna work together, you know. And I brought everybody in very early. John, you came on.
It was my first. I was busy on another job, cutting a movie, and then one day I have the 2-hour interview, and then the next time I'm like, yeah, okay, let's have a Zoom, and I think it was a 3-hour Zoom, but it was the next meeting.
Yeah.
Blitz played me more music and showed me the movie, and.
But you came in very early.
Yes. Oftentimes, as an editor, you're hired the week before, 2 weeks before.
Yep.
And I was hired in November for a March start because Blitz wanted to make sure I was part of all of this. I was watching the drop boxes. I was seeing the costumes.
Yep.
And, you know, I wasn't there till we started shooting,
Yep.
but I was a part of the movie.
And that, for me, is very important. I think a film operates best when information is shared fluidly. And we don't operate in silos. And it was very important. There was one Dropbox, and everybody knew about this Dropbox. I was fastidious about making sure every single thing, if it was coming to me, it had to go to everybody. Because I know, you know, artists are very sensitive about their shit, and they don't like to have, like, you know, things that are still in ideation, you know. Oh, the costume isn't quite done yet, so Blitz, can you wait? No. Put it in a Dropbox. The song's not done, Blitz. You think? No. Put it in a Dropbox, because that's how that next idea is birthed, right? So then the production designer is going, oh my goodness, that's what Francine's thinking about, the color red. So now I know to set up a complementary color when we're painting that house. We don't find out when we come on set and we go, oh my goodness, it's a red dress. Well, the background's red too. We're screwed, you know. So it was very important that everybody shared information and there were no small parts. As far as specifically how we dealt with color theory, and this is kind of a long way to say, it was always collaborative. I knew a few things would matter. We would begin with whites and end with whites. That's kind of these moments of innocence and togetherness. I knew that was going to be key. So when we first see our girls in a tree, they're in these beautiful white tones, right? And then when they finally come back together around the tree, same tree, by the way, for those of you who didn't catch it, it was really, really good to see that. I also knew red will represent power, and I knew that I'll need Suge Avery to pass that color to Celie. So when we do Miss Celie's pants, those pants that she rips off, and now you have these beautiful sequin pants, that was all quite intentional, making sure that we were keeping with the color theory. But I'll also say one thing that I think is quite important, Dan Lawson and myself talked about a lot, which was the fact that a lot of period films kind of operate on a sepia / desaturated / black and white tonality. And Dan and I, you know, talked a lot about this, to the fact that we really believe it's because a lot of the reference photography is actually photos from 100 years ago, right? And so that has kind of become a false kind of way into the past. And that's how we think about the past. We decided very early we were going to push into these photographs and arrive where people lived in color, vivid color, which meant that it would also create a level of proximity to audiences today, where we weren't going to be afraid of color, and also remembering that these people lived in an era of no ACs, no fans. They sweat, their skin reflected light. So light and color was going to be vivid. And I think that, you know, this alone, we knew was going to be quite a different view into the past.
And I understand why you withheld the color purple until the second half of the film, but I'd love to hear your take on that aspect.
Absolutely. Well, you know, it goes back to Alice Walker's brilliant words, you know, when she says, you know, it pisses God off if you walk past the color purple in the field and don't notice it. And I think what she was kind of alluding to was the rarity of the color, right? And the specialness of the color. And the fact that the color itself wasn't something that appeared so often. And in a way, I also equated it to the Celie character and how rare her character was to have that capacity for love, compassion, forgiveness, right? And so from the very beginning, we knew that purple was going to be sacred, and we were only going to use it with deep intention and rarity, you know. But I think all of it was just really in service of Alice Walker's work.
John, the I'm here moment with Fantasia, where she knocks it out of the park, is so straightforward. It's very simple. Can you tell us about not only shooting, but also editing that sequence?
Well, Blitz, you know, we often had talked about things before he would shoot them, and he said, this is going to just be Fantasia singing. Of course, it's not just Fantasia singing. It's quite a complicated shot inside, which has lots of, you know, little tiny moves to make it perfect and is beautifully lit. And when she comes outside, you know, again, it's very simple. There's 2 cameras, and we don't cut a lot. And when we're at the moment where she's singing how she's beautiful and how she's here, we're just hearing her voice, and it's really just her. There's no playback, there's no click track, there's nothing going on, and we're just holding on her. And I think the simplicity of that stands out in the film. And I mean, in a way, it's the most presentational, most Broadway-like moment, but it's earned by the end of the movie, and she totally knocks it out of the park.
And Blitz, you alluded to the lighting in the film, but I would love to hear you talk about working with your DP. There's always source. I noticed the source of lighting, and it creates this, you know, deep darks and deep lights.
Well, I mean, again, shout out to Dan Lawston. When I
Worked with Guillermo
del Toro. But what I love about Dan was Dan's done big stunty stuff like John Wick, you know, which is just madness. And then he's done deeply emotional and sensitive work like, you know, Shape of Water and Nightmare Alley and stuff like that. So I knew our movie was going to oscillate between those two big, flamboyant, ostentatious, kind of acrobatic types of sequences, like Push the Button, Shagavi's Coming to Town. These were big, epic moments. But I also knew we were going to earn everything based on these emotional, sensitive scenes. And so, you know, picking Dan was a no-brainer for me. I'm very thankful he said yes, because he is, I call him the Danish assassin. He is so, I thought I was hyper-prepared. He is insanely prepared. The thing I also loved about Dan was him and I, from day one, our very first Zoom, 2 of our favorite movies were the same. Top 2. Soy Cuba, I Am Cuba, and Apocalypse Now. Yeah, those, and literally he'll come to my house and that's all we watched. It was insane. Just literally, you know, on weekends we'll get together, I'll order some Ghanaian food, and, you know, we'll sit there and just watch these 2 movies back to back. And a few things were key for us. Soy Cuba, the way in which the camera is liberated. And the camera is, and if you haven't seen it, please find, it's very hard to find, but it is one of the most incredibly dexterous movies in terms of camera movement. And as someone who comes from quite a culture of movement and rhythm and cadence, that is like, I could relate to that kind of filmmaking, where the camera wasn't static and wasn't voyeuristic, and it was most immersive. And Dan is that kind of filmmaker, quite immersive in how the camera moves. And then Apocalypse Now for just these vivid colors and similar immersion of camera. So Dan and I, from day one, there was that language around how we were going to make this film work. The other thing too is a lot, and this is another Achilles heel of many musicals, is that they appear to be two different movies. One is, acrobatic and insane, how liberated the camera is when you have dance sequences, and the other is how static and traditional when we get into dialogue coverage. And so, Dan and I very early were like, we're not going to do that. The camera is going to be ass-free. So I'm sure you remember the shot where Mr. comes to ask for Nettie's hand, and then before you know it, we boom all the way up on this crane shot to find the girls in the window. There were several shots like that where those kinds of shots are often reserved for big dance, big epic scenes and setups where the camera flies over people. We did it in regular, everyday scenes and always kept the camera alive. And I think that was a very, very important thing to make sure that when we were bridging our big dance sequences with our dialogue scenes, there was some synergy. And these weren't two worlds that we were forcing together. I also would bring Fatima Robinson, my choreographer, and talk to her about, look, we're going to be going out of this musical number. I can't just go from that to, basic coverage. We have to talk about how we're going to move into that. And so sometimes we'll choreograph past the number. We'll choreograph into dialogue sometimes just to make sure that these transitions were thought out clearly. In terms of dance lighting, and this is kind of where, we were very clear that we were going to be in warm southern light, because that was going to be a big character itself. Yeah. And these big, big shafts of light that kind of pour in from these large windows, which then kind of cause these silhouettes, you know what I mean? And so I think that was something big. And then we also realized that when we got into Seeley's headspace, we'll need a level of sleekness to kind of delineate reality from fantasy a bit. So that's where the steel blue light and these like very sleek moments, like when Seeley's on that giant gramophone, it's like you have this sleek light when we push into the movie and it goes from black and white to color. It just becomes this sleekness. And so we were very thoughtful about that as well. But I think, yes, it was really about color and movement of camera, all with the goal of creating an experience.
And this is a kudos to you that this is a musical, and the scene that took my breath away emotionally was the dining room sequence where all hell breaks loose. Tell us about directing that scene. And Danielle Brooks, all of your actors are amazing.
That was nightmarish to shoot. I have
Why
to
was
say.
it nightmarish?
Well, because COVID. You forget that? Remember when we couldn't come out? Yes, that we shot in deep COVID. And the only thing that I actually had all 8 actors there for was my wide establishing shot. And I'm so glad. And I always tell everybody, start with the wide, because we never got the whole cast back ever again. So, again, kudos to this man for the magic trick of making it feel like yes. I would go on record to say it is one of the most incredible, scenes of people sitting at a table ever. I will go on record and say that all 8 characters had their beats, and the timing of that, and the editing process, and the thoughtfulness of how long to hold on whom, and the reaction shots, which, by the way, were difficult because in any of the coverage, I never had the person they were playing against there. yeah, it was tough. So I had stand-ins. I had people who, didn't quite look like the people, so we had to shoot over their shoulders. It was really, really tough. And it wasn't even like we came back the next day and we knocked it out. Well, then it became like, all right, so I'm not going to have this side of the table, so I got to shoot this side. Then it took us close to 5 different days. And not like, because, COVID, it's like, oh, you're going to need 5 days to recover. So it was like, oh, somebody's got COVID. All right, we got to wait 10 days to shoot it. So it was like the scene that felt like it'll never end. I mean, when I shot the last person out, I literally celebrated. Because I was like, thank God we finally have it. But I will say, Danielle Brooks's turn from that laugh to that cry,
It's masterful.
I remember everybody behind the monitor tearing up because of how brilliant that turn was. And I'll throw it to John because, you had to assemble all of this.
Well, at a certain point, it became a joke because I would go, hey, guys, I'm going to go take another pass on that scene because there was always more to do. Because in any dinner scene, you have to, or anything where people are stuck in their chairs anywhere, you have to keep everybody involved. And if you forget what someone thinks in there, it's going to distract you. And everybody has changing attitudes all the time. There's so many reaction shots. And, there was a pass for, at first it was Sophia's story. Then it was, let's get Celie right. Then it was, get Mr. right. And you still have a scene each time, but you're finessing it. And then Squeak needed something extra to get her out the door. And without question, it's the scene that we worked on more than anything else. And, it's just kind of an amazing scene when you think Sophia got out of jail. Yeah. Celie is about to leave and go to Memphis, and her life will change. Mr. is about to be outed, and yet, even with all this drama, I think this is an interesting thing in the entire movie, and it's nothing we were ever pushing for again, but humor that diffuses tension. And that scene has more of it. It allows us, there are probably 4 or 5 little moments of humor that the tension builds. John Baptiste wants to leave. And that happens again and again in that scene, and I think it lets you get more tension out of it. And I think the whole movie feels like that because, let's face it, when things get dark, there is humor there.
And Blitz, before I let you guys go, I want to ask you, the film deals with domestic violence, it deals with racial violence, and these are issues that are still relevant today. Can you tell us about the importance of the story in this day and age?
Wow. Alice Walker's brilliant novel was published the year I was born, 1982. Mm. So it tells you how much has not changed based on how relevant this information is. Yes, issues of not only gender-based violence, but also discriminations based on orientation, sexual orientation, race. All of these things are still deeply contentious in our worlds, but it's also the realization that it's all about trauma, that hasn't been confronted, thus passed on. And each generation comes and confronts the same problems. That means that the work hasn't been done. And I think that it is, especially for young people who will see this film, I think it's important that they recognize that, it's all inherited trauma. And they will have to recognize its sources, and they will have to do the work. It's like, the Isabella Wilkerson cast concept that, and by the way, shout out to Ava DuVernay, whose brilliant movie Origins is out. And Ava was very helpful when I made my very first movie in Ghana. She was the first person to get it to Netflix. And that changed my life. I wouldn't be here without her great benevolence, so I'm grateful to her. But her brilliant movie explores this concept of, it's the house that, you kind of inherit. And it has its cracks, and it has its, you can easily say, well, all these cracks and foundational problems existed before I got here. Why do I have to do anything about it? Well, you live in it now, and it's on us to start to heal. And I think that one of the biggest things that has happened to me, and we haven't talked about this yet, but when I reached out to Fantasia to play this role, she declined. And declined because she had played it on Broadway, and it was deeply traumatizing for her. Her life at the time, is very, very akin to Celie's. And she was dealing with deep trauma that the Broadway show had only made deeper. And I sat with her. I actually flew down to North Carolina, and I said, I want to play you some of the new music we're working on, but I also want to show you some of the things I've been sketching and some of the ideas I have, which is to give Celie this sprawling imagination. And she looked at me and said, Blitz, I'm in. And I didn't understand why, but later on, we've been doing these thousands of Q&As, so everything comes out. And she talks now about, and this is when we were at CinemaCon, and they asked her, what does she take from this? And she said, I was healed. And I went home that night and I wept, because to be a small part of Fantasia's healing journey is why we do this art. It also made me realize, thank you. It also made me realize that if Fantasia going through this journey of Celie's imagination and being able to find her healing through it, I immediately went, others will be able to find their healing through it. And that for me has I would say there's no reward, award, anything that anybody can ever give me that would equate to what Fantasia has given me, which is the realization of the importance of this work we do. And her submitting to that work and her allowing herself to be a vessel is still something I can never repay. And I really hope that people will, gravitate and find their own healing in it and share it with family, share it with friends, and have their moments to understand that, we have a long way to go. We haven't moved as far as we would like to go, and we have to ask why. And often it's all layered in this trauma that we have not dealt with. Yeah. So,
but I want to go back to what you mentioned about pain and joy. What I love about your take on the story is that there's hopefulness. There's this sense of joy with all the pain, and you send us with a sense of hope. And for that, thank you so much.
Thank you guys. Such a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah.
Such a pleasure.